Okay, this video is going to give you some tips showing you how you get from this point here, and this is the piece of acrylic that you are supplied with by your teacher as part of your skills challenge, to this point here and then onto the next stage. You'd have had a go at already cutting this out during the lesson, and hopefully will have picked up the all-important working characteristics of the material. You will have found out, for example, that acrylic is very brittle, and if it isn't supported properly as you're cutting it, that it will break, crack or shatter. Let's look at how we're going to actually cut out most of the shape. Now we're going to be using a manufacturing process called wasting within this, and essentially all that's doing is removing waste material until you end up with what you want. In this instance, it's this child's rocket shape. That's the thing that we want to end up with. And to prove your skill, we want to be able to see that line at the end. So you don't want to be cutting it off. For this reason, if we look at my example here, I've marked on a line that leaves 1 millimetre or so between my finish line of the rocket and the line I'm going to cut. Now we leave a gap for two reasons. First of all, when some of you are cutting, you're going to be a bit wobbly, and it gives us a bit of a safety net. But secondly, as part of the finishing process, after we've cut it, we're going to be using a tool called a file, over which we have greater control. So the file removes material much less quickly than the saw does. So the saw essentially is there just to try and rough the shape out, and then the file is going to be there in order to make it much more accurate. And don't forget, that's actually what we're going to be marking at the end of this. Have a look at this example. This one here has been roughed out with a saw, and you can see that gap between the waste and the finish line. This is the bit that we're going to file down. I'll show you that in a moment. Let's look at how we're going to cut it out first of all. You're going to hold the material in one of these. And this one here is called a metalwork vise, and they're usually found underneath of the bench. We're going to trap it in the woodwork vise here, and there's a block underneath of the vise which we trap inside of this vise here to hold it securely. This is a very heavy thing, and if it jumped out of here and fell on your foot, then it could cause quite serious injury. So you need to make sure that that's secured onto the bench. Let's look at how we're going to position my work now, because there are some tricks in terms of positioning that will help you to safeguard your line, and that's a key thing. I'm going to be using this steel jaws of the vise to protect my final line so that I can't cut too much off. And that's a problem that some Year 7s have. They end up cutting too much off accidentally. So if we look at the line here of the wing, I'm going to be placing that just inside my vise here, so that the line of the wing is brought just inside of the vise line. Now that means that I can't cut too much off. So I'm going to cut just down the side now with my coping saw, and then we'll look at my line. I'm going to run the saw forward twice, just to give myself a key, and then I'm going to start cutting. Holding my frame upright, 2 hands on the handle, and the acrylic is nice and low in the vise so that it doesn't break. Okay, so that's removed that piece of waste material. If we look at it now, we can see that my line is still intact. Perfect. If I have a go at this now, this uses a slightly different skill, because I'm going to have to stop part way through the cut and change direction. I'm still going to be safeguarding this line inside the vise again, so we're going to be pulling it just inside there, and again taking my coping saw and then I need to stop when I get to that point so that I don't cut into my line, and I now need to cut this line. If you try and cut it straight, you'll find it easier than trying to cut the curve. Curve can actually be put on with a file afterwards. So I'm going to move the material now into the other side of the vise. Here's my line again that I'm aiming for, and I'm going to pull that inside the vise jaw, and I'm now going to cut straight down to meet the other line that I've done. Okay, my line is still safe. Yeah? Now you repeat that process all the way around, looking for opportunities to put that line inside of your vise so that it's safe, and making those cuts using this side of the vise and using the other side of the vise, moving it round appropriately. The next process is then using the file. Okay, and I'm going to be using my safeguarding the line technique here again, and if I show you with this wing line here, that's the line that I want to end up on. So I'm going to pull that just down below the top of the vise line, and then I'm going to take up my file, and this particular file is a half round file, which means the top of it is rounded and the underneath is flat. Now the rounded bit is if you're doing curves, and the flat bit is if you're trying to do a flat surface. For this one I'm going to be using the flat surface. It has a handle on one end, but you are supposed to hold the other end of the file with a thumb and forefinger, and then you're going to work that in that direction until I get down to the top of my vise. Now the noise has changed slightly. So there's no way I could go too far. Now if we look at that, we can see that I've still got that line perfectly in place. So I could pop that up a little bit more and do a little bit more filing. When you come to do this curve here, position your work nice and low, because we know that we're going to snap it off if it's too high in the vise. I'm going to use the flat side of this again because it's an external curve, and I'm going to just be working the file like this, constantly keeping an eye and check on the line to ensure that I don't take too much off. Okay, now that process, like the cutting, is repeated all the way round until you've got down to that line.